When a critically wounded Navy SEAL was wheeled into the ER, the entire dynamic of the night shift shifted in a heartbeat. He locked eyes with Nurse Hannah, the very same woman the rest of the staff dismissed as a quiet pushover, and mercilessly overloaded with grunt work and snapped a crisp salute. In that instant, the hospital realized their easy target was anything but. The fluorescent lights of Seattle's Mercy General Hospital flickered with a sterile, unforgiving hum. It was 3 a.m., the hour when the rest of the world was asleep, but in the emergency department, the chaos had merely settled into a simmer. For 32-year-old Hannah Jefferson, the night shift wasn't just a schedule, it was a daily exercise in psychological endurance. Hannah was a registered nurse, but if you observed the dynamics of the ER floor, you would think she was indentured servitude. She was quiet, meticulous, and unfailingly polite traits that in a high-stress, ego-driven environment painted a massive target on her back. The ringleader of the torment was head nurse Brenda Higgins. Brenda was a 20-year veteran of the hospital who commanded the floor not with respect, but with a petty, tyrannical grip. She favored the loud, the gossipy, and the dramatic. Hannah was none of those things. She kept her head down, charting her patients with an almost mechanical precision, and never engaged in the break-room politics. To Brenda, this quiet stoicism was interpreted as an insult. "Jefferson!" Brenda's shrill voice cut through the quiet hum of the nurse's station. Hannah looked up from the computer terminal, adjusting her scrubs. "Yes, Brenda. Room 402 needs a clean-up. The patient threw up his contrast dye. And when you're done playing janitor-doctor, Alistair wants you to redo the IV lines on the entire left wing. Apparently you didn't secure the tape to his liking." It was a blatant demotion of duties. Cleaning up vomit was typically the job of the environmental services team, and redoing perfectly sound EV lines was just a waste of medical supplies. But Hannah didn't argue. She never argued. She simply nodded, closed her chart, and walked toward the supply closet. As she walked away, she heard the snickering. Dr. Richard Alistair, a second-year resident with a God complex, and a trust fund, leaned against the counter, sipping an espresso. "I don't know how she passed her boards, Brenda. She moves like a ghost. No hustle, no instinct. I asked her for a fast push of epinephrine yesterday, and she actually took the time to double-check the dosage on the monitor before handing it to me." "She's a liability, Richard." Brenda agreed loudly enough for Hannah to hear. "She's just not built for the ER. I give her 2 more months before she cracks and goes to work at a suburban podiatrist's office." In the supply closet, Hannah gripped the edges of the plastic shelving. She closed her eyes and took a slow, measured breath. In through the nose, out through the mouth. A tactical breathing technique. 4 seconds in, hold for 4 seconds out. She looked at her hands. They were steady. Completely, terrifyingly steady. Underneath the sleeve of her scrub top, hidden from the world, was a jagged patch of scar tissue wrapping around her left bicep, a souvenir from a shrapnel burst in the Coringal Valley. They didn't know. Nobody at Mercy General knew. When Hannah applied for the job, she had handed in a heavily redacted resume, leaning on her civilian nursing credentials, and leaving a massive, unexplained gap in her work history. She wanted a quiet life. After 3 tours in Afghanistan, as a trauma specialist with the United States Army Medical Command, attached to elite special operations units, she had seen enough blood and chaos to last 100 lifetimes. She had held the lives of the military's most lethal operators in her hands, while mortar shells rained down around their surgical tent. Compared to a war zone, Brenda Higgins was just a loud, annoying mosquito. Hannah tolerated the bullying, the micromanagement, and the insults because it was the price she paid for anonymity. She just wanted to clock in, help people, and clock out without the crushing weight of leadership on her shoulders. But the bullying escalated. By week's end, Brenda was actively sabotaging Hannah. She accidentally deleted Hannah's PTO requests. She assigned Hannah double shifts, forcing her to work 16 hours straight with the most difficult combative patients. When a patient in room 3 crashing from sepsis was saved because Hannah silently adjusted the drip rate before Dr. Alistair even realized what was happening. Alistair took the credit, and Brenda formally reprimanded Hannah for acting outside her scope of practice. "You are a nurse, Jefferson, not a doctor," Brenda had hissed, slamming her hand on the desk. "You follow orders. You don't think. You don't improvise. You are the bottom of the food chain here. Remember your place." Hannah had just stared at her, her eyes as cold and flat as slate. "Understood," she whispered. But a storm was brewing. The quiet could only last so long. It happened on a Tuesday night. The rain was lashing against the glass doors of the emergency department in heavy, violent sheets. The shift had been agonizingly slow, leaving Dr. Alistair and Brenda ample time to make Hannah reorganize the crash carts for the 3rd time that week. Then the red phone at the central desk rang. Not the standard triage line, the red phone, the direct line from the county's emergency dispatch, reserved for mass casualties or high-profile critical traumas. Brenda snatched it up, her face immediately drained of color. How far out? 5 minutes blast trauma. Who is the patient? She paused, her eyes widening. "Understood. We are clearing Trauma Bay 1. She slammed the phone down, panic radiating from her. "Alistair, we have a VIP incoming. A joint tactical operation down by the shipyards went wrong. An explosive device detonated. We have 1 critical. Massive hemorrhage blast trauma, potential pneumothorax." Dr. Alistair stood up, spilling his coffee. "A VIP, like a politician." "Worse," Brenda snapped, rushing to put on her trauma gown. "Federal Task Force, a United States Navy SEAL. The dispatch said he took the brunt of a breaching charge to shield his team. The local SWAT and federal agents are locking down the hospital as we speak." The atmosphere in the ER instantly shifted from lethargic to electric panic. To a civilian hospital, an elite military operator with combat-grade explosive injuries was a terrifying prospect. The sheer force of military-grade explosives did things to the human body that textbook medical school didn't prepare you for. "Jefferson," Brenda barked. "Get out of the way. I want you in the corner. Don't touch anything, don't speak. Just stand by the wall and hand us gauze if we ask for it. This is way above your pay grade. Alistair, you're the lead." Hannah silently backed into the shadow of Trauma Bay, one slipping on a yellow gown, a mask, and sterile gloves. Moments later, the double doors blew open. The noise was deafening. Paramedics rushed in, flanked by 2 men in heavy tactical gear, their faces smeared with soot and sweat. On the gurney was a man who looked like he had been dragged through hell. "Lieutenant Commander David Reynolds," the lead paramedic shouted over the chaos. 36 years old, sustained close proximity blast from an IED. Tourniquet applied to the right femoral high and tight, but he's still losing blood. Blood pressure is tanking 70/40. He's got diminished breath sounds on the left side. They transferred him to the trauma bed. The SEAL was massive, a mountain of muscle, but he was pale as a ghost, covered in dirt blood, and the distinct smell of cordite and burned flesh. He was drifting in and out of consciousness, his chest heaving unevenly. "All right on my count," Alistair yelled, his voice cracking slightly. 1, 2, 3. They moved him. The monitor instantly began shrieking, a high-pitched rapid beeping that signaled imminent cardiac collapse. "He's crashing!" Brenda screamed, fumbling with the IV lines. "I can't get a vein. His veins are collapsing from hypovolemic shock." Get a central line, Alistair ordered, grabbing a scalpel. His hands were shaking. He looked at the SEAL's ruined chest, trying to figure out where to insert a chest tube. The blast had warped the anatomy, swelling the tissue massively. I can't find the landmark for the incision. There's too much tissue damage. Doc, you need to decompress his chest now. One of the tactical operators roared from the doorway. He's suffocating. I'm trying, Alistair yelled back, sweat pouring down his forehead. Brenda, clamp that bleeder on his leg, the tourniquet slipped. Brenda grabbed a pair of hemostats and jammed them blindly into the bloody mess of the SEAL's thigh. Reynolds, despite being half-conscious, let out a guttural, agonized groan and violently flinched. "Hold him down!" Brenda yelled, panicking. "He's non-compliant. Jefferson, get over here and hold his leg." From the corner of the room, Hannah watched. She saw Alistair holding the scalpel at the wrong angle, risking puncturing the heart if he pushed through the swollen chest wall. She saw Brenda blindly digging into a wound, shredding the surrounding tissue instead of clamping the artery. The monitor's beeping grew frantic. He has 60 seconds before his heart stops. Hannah's mind calculated the civilian facade instantly burning away. She didn't walk over to hold his leg. She stepped directly up to the head of the bed, right next to Dr. Alistair. "Move," she said. Her voice wasn't quiet. It was a sharp, commanding whip crack that cut right through the yelling in the room. Alistair blinked, stunned. "What?" "I said move, Doctor." Hannah pushed Alistair's shoulder with enough force to physically shove the resident a foot away from the table. She snatched the scalpel from his trembling hand. "Jefferson, are you insane?" Brenda shrieked. "Security. Get her away from the patient." Hannah ignored her. With surgical precision, she didn't hesitate. She found the exact intercostal space by feel, pressing her thumb hard into the bruised ribs, and made a swift, clean incision. She dropped the scalpel, grabbed a pair of Kelly forceps, punched through the pleura, and inserted the chest tube in one fluid, continuous motion. A massive rush of trapped air and blood hissed out into the collection canister. The SEAL's chest immediately deflated, and the monitor's erratic screaming began to slow to a rapid but steady rhythm. "Oxygen sat is rising," the respiratory therapist yelled, staring at Hannah in shock. Hannah didn't stop. She spun around to the SEAL's leg. Brenda was still holding the bloody hemostats, frozen in disbelief. "Let go of the clamp, Brenda," Hannah ordered, her tone colder than ice. You're fired. You're completely fired." Brenda stammered, her face purple with rage. "You just assaulted a doctor. You're operating without a license. Get away from him." Brenda reached out to shove Hannah away from the bed. Before Brenda's hand could make contact, a massive blood-stained hand shot up from the gurney. Everyone in the room froze. Lieutenant Commander David Reynolds, eyes still clouded with pain and heavy doses of field morphine, had reached out and locked his grip around Brenda's wrist with a crushing, vice-like force. Brenda let out a squeak of terror. The SEAL didn't look at Brenda. He slowly turned his head, fighting through the agony, and locked his eyes on Hannah. He stared at the way she held the combat gauze, the tactical stance she had instinctively taken at the side of the bed, the cold, absolute authority in her eyes. Reynolds coughed a wet, ragged sound. A weak, bloody smile touched the corner of his lips. "I'd know. That bedside manner. Anywhere." Reynolds rasped his voice, barely a whisper. Yet it silenced the entire room. He weakly released Brenda's wrist, and with agonizing effort brought his blood-soaked right hand up to his forehead. "Good to see you. Major Jefferson." The silence in Trauma Bay, one was absolute, save for the rhythmic, steady hiss of the ventilator and the rhythmic beep, beep, beep of the cardiac monitor. It was the sound of a man who had just been dragged backward over the threshold of death. Brenda Higgins stared at the bloody, calloused hand of the Navy SEAL that had just released her wrist. She rubbed her skin, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "Major!" She squeaked, her voice entirely stripped of its usual tyrannical bass. She's a floor nurse." Dr. Richard Allister stood a few feet away, his scalpel still resting on the sterile tray where Hannah had tossed it. His face was the color of old parchment. He looked from the massive scarred soldier on the table to the quiet, unremarkable woman standing beside him. The two federal tactical operators stationed at the door, who had previously treated the hospital staff as mere obstacles, suddenly shifted their posture. The taller one, a man with the name Tape Miller across his chest carrier, stepped into the harsh fluorescent light. He stared hard at Hannah, taking in the way she held her shoulders, the grim set of her jaw, and the absolute lack of panic in her eyes. "Jefferson," Miller said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "Major Hannah Jefferson, Army Medical Command. The Jefferson from the Korengal Valley Forward Operating Base." Hannah didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the chest tube drainage system, watching the dark venous blood pool into the plastic reservoir. "Keep pressure on that femoral artery specialist," she ordered, addressing the paramedic who was still holding the tourniquet. "His pressure is stabilizing, but he's still hypovolemic. We need O-negative blood in him, rapid infuse right now." Miller immediately squared his shoulders. "Yes, ma'am." He didn't hesitate. He didn't look to Dr. Allister for confirmation. He grabbed the cooler of emergency blood from the corner and tossed 2 bags to the respiratory therapist. "You heard the Major. Push it." "Wait." Brenda finally snapped out of her stupor, her face flushing a deep, angry red. "You can't take orders from her. She is a subordinate. She just assaulted a physician's security." Miller turned to Brenda, his hand resting casually but deliberately on the grip of his sidearm. The air in the room grew suddenly violently cold. "Ma'am, you are currently shouting in a trauma bay while my team leader is bleeding out. If you do not step back against that wall and close your mouth, I will physically remove you from this room for interfering with a federal operation. Do you understand me?" Brenda shrank back against the supply cabinet, her bravado shattering against the brick wall of Miller's lethal calm. Dr. Allister finally found his voice. "This is highly irregular. I am the attending resident. You should be reviewing your anatomy textbooks, Doctor." Hannah said, her voice quiet, flat, and devastating. She finally turned her head to look at him. "You were aiming for the 3rd intercostal space, but your angle was 50 degrees off. You were about to drive a blade directly into his pericardium. If you had made that cut, he would be dead." Allister swallowed hard. He had no defense. He knew she was right. The sheer terror of the moment had blinded him, and this quiet, invisible nurse had seen the lethal error in a fraction of a second. "The surgical team is on the elevator," the charge nurse called out from the hallway, breaking the tension. "OR3 is prepped and waiting." "Let's move him," Hannah commanded. She didn't ask for permission. She grabbed the head of the gurney, Miller grabbed the foot, and they blew through the double doors, leaving Brenda and Dr. Allister standing alone in the blood-slicked trauma bay. The adrenaline carried Hannah through the next 2 hours. She bypassed the standard scrub-in protocols and stood in the gallery of the operating room, watching as the chief of trauma surgery meticulously repaired the damage to Commander Reynolds' chest and leg. It was familiar territory. The smell of cauterized flesh, the sharp tang of iodine, the rhythmic hum of the bypass machines. It was the sensory symphony of her former life, a life she had tried to bury. By 6 a.m., the sun was beginning to bleed a dull grey light through the hospital's high windows. Commander Reynolds was stable and resting in the surgical intensive care unit. The crisis was over. But for Hannah, the real war was just beginning. As she walked out of the men's locker room, having borrowed a clean pair of scrub pants to replace her blood-soaked ones, she was met by 2 armed hospital security guards. "Hannah Jefferson," the larger guard said, looking incredibly uncomfortable. "We need you to come with us to the administrative wing, immediately." Hannah felt the exhaustion settling into her bones, an ache that radiated from her old shrapnel scar down to her fingertips. She knew exactly what was happening. Brenda Higgins was not a woman who accepted defeat. She was a petty tyrant, and her authority had just been dismantled in front of an entire emergency department. "Lead the way," Hannah said simply. The hospital boardroom was a stark contrast to the ER. It smelled of lemon polish and expensive coffee. The long mahogany table felt like a judge's bench. Sitting at the head of the table was Dr. Harrison Campbell, the chief of medicine, looking weary and severely stressed. To his left sat the hospital's legal counsel, a sharp-faced woman, furiously typing on a laptop. To his right sat Brenda Higgins and Dr. Richard Allister. Brenda had washed her face and reapplied her lipstick, adopting the posture of a deeply offended victim. Allister sat with his arms crossed, his jaw tight, but it was the man sitting at the far end of the table that caught Hannah's attention. He wore a crisp, immaculate dress uniform of the United States Navy. The silver eagles of a captain rested on his shoulders. Hannah stepped into the room. She didn't sit. She stood at parade rest, her hands clasped lightly behind her back, her posture perfectly straight. "Nurse Jefferson." Dr. Campbell began rubbing his temples. "We are here to discuss the deeply disturbing events of this morning. Head Nurse Higgins has filed a formal grievance, co-signed by Dr. Allister, citing gross insubordination, physical assault on a physician, and practicing medicine without a license. She shoved me away from a critical patient," Allister stated loudly, leaning forward. "She endangered a life to play hero. She is a menace." Brenda added, her voice laced with venom. "I have documented a history of her insubordination. She operates outside her scope. She is a danger to Mercy General, and I want her terminated and reported to the State Nursing Board immediately." Dr. Campbell sighed. "Hannah, you physically removed a doctor from a procedure and performed an invasive surgical maneuver, a chest tube thoracostomy. That is entirely outside the legal scope of a registered nurse. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Hannah looked at Campbell, then at Brenda. Her gaze was devoid of anger. It was simply clinical. The patient was in tension, pneumothorax. Dr. Allister was unable to locate the anatomical landmarks due to blast trauma swelling. He was about to puncture the heart. The patient had approximately 60 seconds before complete cardiovascular collapse. I intervened to preserve life. "You are not qualified to make that assessment," Allister shouted, his face turning red. "You are just a nurse." "That is enough. Doctor!" A deep, commanding voice echoed through the room. The Navy captain at the end of the table stood up. He picked up a thick manila folder from the table. It wasn't a hospital file. It was secured with a red classification tape. "Dr. Campbell." The captain said, his voice calm, but carrying the heavy weight of authority. "My name is Captain Thomas Hayes, United States Naval Special Warfare Command. I am here as the commanding officer of Lieutenant Commander Reynolds." Hayes walked slowly around the table, stopping directly behind Hannah. "I received a very interesting phone call this morning from my tactical team." Hayes continued, his eyes locked on Allister. "They informed me that an ER resident nearly killed one of my most decorated operators due to panic and incompetence. They also informed me that his life was saved by a ghost." Brenda scoffed. "She's no ghost. She's a liability." Captain Hayes ignored her entirely. He dropped the manila folder onto the mahogany table. It hit the wood with a heavy, definitive thud. When Hannah Jefferson applied to this hospital, Hayes said, opening the folder, she provided a civilian resume. What she did not provide, because it was highly classified until 18 months ago, was her full military service record. Hayes pulled out a sheet of paper and slid it across the table toward Dr. Campbell. Hannah Jefferson didn't spend the last decade working in suburban clinics. Hayes stated the temperature in the room dropping. She was a major in the United States Army Nurse Corps. More specifically, she was an advanced practice trauma nurse attached to the Joint Special Operations Command. She spent 4 tours in active combat zones. She was the chief triage officer for a Tier 1 surgical unit. Dr. Campbell's eyes widened as he read the document. The hospital lawyer stopped typing. She literally co-authored the Department of Defense's field manual on blast trauma resuscitation. Hayes continued, his voice echoing off the walls. She has performed more emergency thoracostomies under active mortar fire than Dr. Alistair will perform in his entire, comfortable civilian career. She holds a bronze star with a valor device. When my men are bleeding out in the dirt, she is exactly who they pray to see. The silence in the room was absolute. Brenda's mouth hung open. The smugness drained from her face, replaced by a sudden, terrifying realization of her own insignificance. She had spent months tormenting a woman who had walked through hell. Alistair looked physically ill. The reality of his own incompetence laid bare in front of the chief of medicine, and a military commander was crushing him. You, Captain Hayes pointed a finger at Alistair, froze. You lacked the nerve and the skill to save my man. And you, he turned his gaze to Brenda, allowed your petty ego to actively interfere with a life-saving procedure. Your tactical team reported that you attempted to physically stop Major Jefferson from securing a fatal bleed. Dr. Campbell slowly took off his glasses. The exhaustion in his eyes was replaced by a hard, furious glint. Dr. Alistair, Campbell said, his voice deceptively quiet. As of this moment, your residency at Mercy General is suspended pending a full medical board review of your actions in Trauma Bay 1. You will clear out your locker and leave the premises. Alistair stood up, his hands shaking. Dr. Campbell, you can't. My father is on the board. Your father cannot save you from a malpractice investigation involving a federal military operator. Campbell snapped. Get out. Alistair didn't say another word. He turned and practically fled the room. Campbell then turned to Brenda. Brenda shrank back into her chair, her 20 years of bullying suddenly collapsing under the weight of hard, unyielding karma. Brenda, you have fostered a toxic, dangerous environment in my emergency department for years. I have overlooked it because you kept the floor moving. But deliberately sabotaging patient care to protect your ego is where I draw the line. Campbell stated, his voice devoid of pity. Your employment at Mercy General is terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you off the property, and I will personally be forwarding this incident report to the State Board of Nursing. Brenda let out a small, pathetic sob. Hannah, please. She looked at the woman she had tormented, begging for mercy. Hannah looked down at her. Her expression didn't change. The Environmental Services team needs someone to mop Trauma Bay. One Brenda. You should probably get going. 2 security guards entered the room. Brenda Higgins, stripped of her power, and her pride, was escorted out in tears. The door clicked shut. The room breathed a collective sigh of relief. Doctor, Campbell looked up at Hannah. Major Jefferson, or Nurse Jefferson, I owe you a profound apology. The administration failed you. We failed this hospital by allowing that culture to fester. The culture is broken, Dr. Campbell, Hannah said quietly. Good nurses are leaving because they are treated like waitstaff by arrogant residents and bullied by insecure management. It costs lives. I agree, Campbell said, leaning forward, which is why I am offering you Brenda's position, head nurse of the emergency department. You have the authority, you clearly have the skill, and God knows you have the respect of anyone who matters. Hannah looked at the polished table. She thought about the quiet life she had wanted. She thought about fading into the background. But then she remembered the terrified young nurses Brenda had berated the patients who suffered because of ego and the chaotic hum of the ER that still deep down felt like home. She couldn't fix the world, but she could fix this hospital. Hannah finally smiled a small, hard smile. I'll take the job, Doctor. But things are going to change around here. No more bullying. No more egos. We do the work or we get out. Captain Hayes stepped forward and extended his hand. Hannah took it, his grip firm and respectful. Thank you, Major, Hayes said. Commander Reynolds asked me to give you a message when he woke up. What's that? Hannah asked. He said to tell you that your bedside manner is still terrible. Hayes smiled. But he owes you a beer. Hannah Jefferson, the new head nurse of Mercy General, finally let out a genuine laugh. The ghost of Kandahar had finally come home, and the night shift would never be the same. If you loved this story of justice and a hidden hero stepping up when it mattered most, hit that like button. Don't forget to share this incredible true-to-life drama with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, deeply human stories of karma, resilience, and second chances. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Hannah's shoes? See you in the next video.